Okay. Well, welcome back, everyone. Today we have a very special guest, a friend and colleague whose work is assigned for today, and who is very generous, having taken some time out of his very busy schedule this morning to be with us. From Colby College from Maine, this is Professor Dean Allbritton. Dean is an associate professor at Colby, having studied Spanish and literary and cultural studies at Stony Brook University. And his work analyzes metaphors of illness and gender in contemporary Spanish culture, which you all saw today in the assigned reading for today. And particularly with an interest in media as the focal points or focalizing points for larger discourses of national and social health. So Dean has worked and published broadly on different subjects in Spanish film and culture, also media studies, with an interest in illness and disability studies, film theory, and contemporary Spanish film and cultural studies. And he is currently working on a manuscript on the cultural histories of HIV/AIDS in Spain, which is part of what you read for today. The title of this work in progress is Feeling Sick, the Early Years of AIDS in Spain. So thanks very much, Dean, for being with us today. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you. And then afterwards, we'll have a Q&A, an informal Q&A if you have some time.
Yeah, sounds great. Sounds great.
Great. Thanks very much.
Okay, I will share my screen. All right. Can you see it, John?
Perfect. Can see it great. Thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm super excited to share this with you all. This is something I've worked on for several years now, as John said, and what you read, that it came from a California article, as well as what you're going to hear right now, is the very basis of the entire book, and it's the first thing I wrote in the book, and it's something that's really meaningful to me and was sort of the reason why the whole book happened, and why I'm interested in exploring this, to kind of see these media representations and what happened with the story of HIV and AIDS in Spain in its early years, in the outbreak. So I'm going to go ahead and start. In the oft-quoted illnesses metaphor, Susan Sontag analyzes what the mediation and metaphorization of illnesses have done to not only common perceptions of sickness, but to specific ills themselves. She concludes by noting how such mediation has served to weaponize metaphors and invest illnesses with meanings that extend far beyond their physical effects. It is thus no surprise that as illnesses are increasingly mediated, reported on, and made known, their mediations rely on distorted perceptions of diseases which color the lived experiences of illness. As recounted in popular media, illness origin stories often take the event of sickness and transform it into a story of good and bad events, or heroic doctors and villainous germs, and the dense morality that often lurks beneath such stories invests concepts like cleanliness, goodness, and safety with heavy moralized meaning. The archive that is produced by this process is, to quote Eugenie Brinkema, pockmarked, an incomplete history that is at once riddled with gaps and stuffed with subjectivities. Such is the case of AIDS in Spain. In 1983, when AIDS was first widely reported on as having arrived in Spain, it was almost immediately dismissed as a disease that only someone else could catch: hemophiliacs, homosexuals, or heroin users. The very first cases of AIDS were misidentified in 1983 as two young hemophiliacs, brothers who died in Andalusia after receiving transfusions of infected blood coagulant from the United States. Later, the medical report of a patient in late 1981 would resurface: a gay man who had traveled to the United States and Turkey and who had become infected after several sexual affairs that deviated from his purportedly stable single partner relationship. And you can see a glimpse of this medical report here. And in the article, obviously, I go into a lot more detail about my thoughts about the single partner relationship story. As the number of AIDS patients in Spain grew, the media fell into the near universal practice of denominating risk groups, patterned after the original cases of AIDS. This practice isolated the panic surrounding AIDS from the public at large, and as a result, AIDS was passed off as a niche illness, one that could only strike a certain subset of the non-normal, deviant, or hedonistic. The establishment of the index case, a person who is identified as the originating case of an illness or epidemic, is one of the first actions made to determine the severity of an outbreak, and it has taken on deep symbolic meaning in the way an illness is represented within a culture. And we can think about COVID-19 and the coronavirus and think about who were the index cases of that and what that has meant for the way that we've interpreted that illness, right? So how does it become the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus? It's because those were the index cases, right? And this is fully to critique that. The erasure of a person or a group of people into a case that is covers up the individual and reduces him or her into a string of recognizable symptoms that coalesce into illness. Similarly, the organization of the findings from index cases into a linear narrative frequently filters an ostensibly neutral medical case through personal beliefs and prejudices. In Contagious, Priscilla Wald refers to this process as the construction of an outbreak narrative, a formulaic plot that begins with an identification of an emerging infection. It includes discussion of the global networks throughout which it travels and chronicles the epidemiological work that ends with its containment. The resulting investigations of epidemiologists, Wald notes, accomplish a series of tasks. They decide what constitutes a specific group or population in illness. They define well-being for the general populace, and they create connections between the disease and the purported lifestyles and habits of different groups. Such criteria form the basis for epidemiological outbreak narratives and, quote, import cultural assumptions that are substantiated by the authority of medical science and the urgency of a public health threat, end quote. And again, not to keep talking about COVID-19, but it's all that me and my students can talk about currently. You think about the sort of dismissal or the proliferation of talk around wet markets, right? And how these are like purportedly way more dangerous than a dry market like the US, right? And so this kind of construction of who's the baddie here, who's clean, who's not, is all part of this construction of an outbreak narrative that imports cultural assumptions from one to and maps it onto another. In this manner, the work of the public health official and or epidemiologist is hardly immune to the dangers of narrativizing or making metaphor of illness. The very first special television report in Spain called Informe Semanal that focused exclusively on AIDS aired on RTVE on May 14th, 1983, and was titled Alarm, the Virus That Comes from California. Alarma el virus que viene de California. The report was shortly followed by AIDS, the illness of the 80s, SIDA, la enfermedad de los 80, in August of that same year. These reports are the first of their kind in Spain, and as such, they serve to both document and establish the Spanish outbreak narrative for AIDS, as well as locate and reify the Spanish index cases, which would in turn come to dominate the public perception and treatment of AIDS in Spain for years to come. As the first report to deal specifically with AIDS as global and national phenomenon, Alarma, el virus que viene de California, solidifies popular beliefs in the disease's foreign origins while aiming for a working definition of what the disease means for Spain. The report opens with a brief description of AIDS as a gay plague, gay pneumonia, and the homosexual syndrome. As a side note, even though it was more widely known by 1983 that homosexuality was not the sole perpetrator of the illness or the only risk groups in AIDS, it remains strongly marked as a gay illness, and particularly in these cases for Spain. They're kind of following up on what was already the narrative in the US and reifying it here. Thus, the early remarks in Alarma, follow the unified moralizing narrative already set up for the beginning of AIDS. Quote, we have before us a new illness, a new syndrome of dark affiliation. The strange Kaposi sarcoma, with threatening and biblical resonances, has become painfully known as the gay plague, end quote. The reference here to the dark affiliation of the disease notes the unexplained origins of the illness, but it also hints at other darker affiliations, the unfathomable sexual acts that gay men committed amongst themselves, perhaps, and the dark continent of Africa, the primordial culprit of so many diseases. And just as a side note, in one of these, Informe Semanal, in fact, where they show Africa, the continent, and just have the word, and I have this on the screen, just have the word SIDA printed on it. So this was sort of the way that the story gets reified, right? Where Africa is just turned into AIDS, right? This is the birthplace of it, right? So the purported strangeness of Kaposi sarcoma in the quote from before, meanwhile, recalls biblical plagues, and in so doing correlates AIDS to sinful actions, hedonistic behaviors, and non-Christian communities. The strangeness and mysteriousness of AIDS is delineated in alarm for a general viewing audience that, as the report implies, could never experience it. In other words, it promises a glimpse into a foreign world, one that is only faintly understood but heavily coded by moralizing narratives, while its audience remains untouched by these biblical resonances. Collapsing medical index cases, right? So it's in Haiti, it's in Haitians, it's in gay groups, right? So collapsing these medical narratives, right, into narratives steeped in luminous Catholic virtues, this report defines who truly belongs to the healthy national community. Such a move presents the homosexual and the heterosexual as polar opposites: promiscuity versus monogamy, unclean homosexual sex versus loving heterosexual sex, urban vice versus traditional values and virtues, also establishing the vulnerability of the first over the immunity of the latter. In a similar move, in a similar fashion, AIDS, the illness of the 80s, aims to showcase the impact of homosexuals to the AIDS crisis while quarantining the main effects of the illness to the United States. Like Alarma, the images of the gay plague in the illness of the 80s recur to familiar homosexual stereotypes while highlighting an increasingly blatant Spanish outbreak narrative. Unlike Alarma, however, the exclusive focus on the United States seems designed to temper public fears in Spain on the reach of the epidemic. If AIDS could be demonstrated as belonging to an outsider community or a distant group of foreigners, the defensible borders of the Spanish body politic could be kept safe from its attack, purportedly. Centering in on San Francisco as the epitome of an ill community, this report moves from citywide panoramas to bustling streets in images that bubble with sexuality. In a short sequence we'll see some stills here. In a short sequence, two men are facing the camera as a third shirtless man walks toward them in passing. The man in the center of the image slowly and admiringly follows the shirtless man with his gaze, turning his head and watching him as he walks by. Another brief sequence shows a tight close-up on a man wearing nothing but bright red shorts. Here's a little GIF for you. The camera follows his the camera follows his brisk shimmying walk for a few seconds. This is the focus of the screen in that moment, right? And of the TV report. As these images flash on screen, the report notes ominously, this illness is difficult to diagnose. It takes time to manifest itself. It may be that many of those affected by it remain aware. No cure is known for this illness. No one knows exactly how it is contracted, nor how it is spread. But these words ring hollow in the veritable parade of gay male sexuality on display in the glistening male bodies that walk across the screen. Even as the report laments that no one knows how AIDS is spread or contracted, the camera focuses tightly on the image of the man's ass in motion. What is this to suggest except a suspicion and fear of gay male sexuality? Perhaps no one truly knew what brought about AIDS, but the illness of the 80s makes a direct correlation between the emergence of AIDS and the flagrant sexuality of gay men in the United States in ways that are obvious and concerted. In theory, constructing the outbreak narrative in this manner allows Spanish media to articulate Spain's ideological and sexual differences from its American neighbors, as well as demonstrate the safety of its healthy and non-tainted community of citizens. This is a flawed strategy, clearly, as the rising number of AIDS cases in Spain almost immediately belied any suggestion of immunity within its borders. For this reason, both this report and Alarma must establish risk groups within its, risk groups that can be considered separate and divisible from the larger body politic.
Mm-hmm.
As Wald writes, the balance of the community marked by immunity is always precarious, with the requisite number of strangers weighing constantly against the threat of too many strangers. Hence social breakdown or anarchy in politics and germs, end quote. We should consider how both of these reports structure their narratives along the lines of the stranger, who alternately is a homosexual, a hemophiliac, or an intravenous drug user, and who is always tainted by illness, sort of from the outset, tainted by illness. If biological immunity requires that we think of the self in terms of a bordered entity that is both exposed and attacked, then establishing a stranger is a way of identifying the dangerous elements that threaten our physical and political borders. Wald's reminder that the stranger is also part and parcel of how we define the boundaries between community and the other is important, given the long history of quarantine and exile in illness. When the stranger, or the other, has already invaded the borders of the body politic, when we already have homosexuals, when we already have intravenous drug users, right, that we can create sort of scapegoat risk groups, right? When the stranger has already invaded the borders of the body politic, something like a political autoimmune response occurs that identifies risk groups, separates them from the community at large, and casts aspersions on their identifiable characteristics as different and dangerous from the dominant culture. Such a move clearly went against the theoretically liberated ideology of the newly minted Spanish democracy. But as many others have also noted, Spanish political ideology was never so fully liberated as the discourse of the time suggested. And John, I think you and Patty Keller's article does some of this as well, right? Where you're thinking about maybe the discourse of the movida and the transition to democracy isn't quite as perfect or liberal or great, rah, rah, yay, as it's being touted. As Illness of the 80s documents the move from gay panic to generalized AIDS panic and eventually back again, it notes how heterosexuals have also been affected by AIDS, particularly hemophiliacs and drug users. And just as a sidebar, we talk about the 4 H's of AIDS in its outbreak, which was heroin users, hemophiliacs, homosexuals, and Haitians. That's what we talk about in the US. And in Spain, we don't have Haitian immigration. So it's really a 3 H's that they tend to talk about the most, and sort of a generalized Africa, as we've seen before. So they note in Illness of the 80s, they note this, how it's happening, how there is an outbreak amongst heterosexuals as well, but puts it only on hemophiliacs and drug users. So in a remarkably similar cluster of images, and this to me is super fascinating, the report details both groups and their specific risk of AIDS infection. While sketching hemophilia and drug addiction in broad terms, a sequence of paired images of men giving themselves injections is shown. So these are shown in sequential order. So at first it goes through the hemophiliac, and then it talks about the drug user. But the pairing of these images to me is remarkable. These 2 sequences follow the same progression of shots. A close-up that focuses on the man's face, which is what we're seeing here, a close-up that focuses on the man's face, head bent, and intently focused on what he is doing. A second close-up on the point of insertion in the arm, and finally, a switch to a medium shot that shows the man from waist up with his arm extended, hand balled into a fist, and inserting the needle. The visual similarities between the sequences of the hemophiliac and the drug user are striking. And their coupling in this report suggests a loose thematic correlation between the two, as dependent on a chemical substance that can both prolong and destroy life. As with the images of the homosexual community earlier, a person is reduced to a risky, poorly understood practice that endangers life. All the same, and despite the correlation between the 3 risk groups, for these news reports, the type of practice still matters. Is the practice a sexual act linked to drugs, lurid bars, and perceived as filthy? Is it a damning need for an addictive drug seen as a consequence of bad behavior or lack of willpower? Or is it a life-saving drug brought about by a faulty body? Even while casually looping the three groups together, La Enfermedad de los 80 makes clear the difference of the hemophiliac. So this is seen, the hemophiliac is ultimately seen as the risk group, or the risk group that matters, and the person that we can save and should save. So in this sequence, so here showing the difference of the hemophiliac, in this sequence, the hemophiliac appears to be middle-aged, dressed in a shirt and shirt and tie, and is seated on a couch in a living room. Behind him is a window with a view to the yard. This mise-en-scène thus evokes family life, relative wealth, health, and class. The drug user, in contrast, as we can see here, is younger, dressed more casually, has a visible tattoo on his forearm. He sits in a windowless, sterile environment that is reminiscent of a hospital or a jail cell. There is no window to the outside in this white tiled room. His age links him to the rising drug culture amongst youth in Spain, and his location institutionalized the illicitness of his act into an authoritative system of medical and judicial power. Although these men are presented as little more than their risky practice, the hemophiliac alone is linked to the theoretically stable, wholesome, and private space of the home. The lawlessness of the drug user is contained within systems of power, and the previous images of homosexuals are simply public displays of unhealthy sex. As in Alarma, as in the first report, this works to define AIDS as a very particular type of illness that affects a small group of pre-selected communities. These communities are in turn defined by and made beholden to the inherently risky practices they perform, practices which expose them to the virus that causes AIDS. After running through the primary groups at risk and demonstrating the little need for worry among the general Spanish public, the report concludes by returning to the spread of AIDS amongst homosexuals. And it notes, quote, "Many homosexuals believe that not enough is being done to help them, even though many millions of dollars are being spent in investigations. They feel more discriminated than ever because of AIDS," end quote. The information, while more or less true, hinges on its even though, which asserts an unknown but vast quantity of money is being spent on these homosexuals, despite their protests to the contrary. As the narrator speaks, the report displays images of men and women sunbathing in a park. The contrast is at once highly ironic and biting. It suggests laziness and an almost regal decadence in the homosexual community amidst the turmoil caused by their risky behaviors. Thus, Illness of the 80s is bookended by the gay body's prowling sexuality and its spoiled luxuriance. It is a stranger's body on display, dangerous, greedy, and infectious. Both Alarm and Illness of the 80s were theoretically impartial and apolitical reports that nevertheless demonstrate the full weight of a media machine bent on constructing an outbreak narrative for Spain. The archive they have constructed tells a specific story, but one that shades in some lines while eliminating vital others. The Spanish index cases that appeared and reappeared, the anonymous gay man in 1982 and the hemophiliac children in 1983, corroborated a global story that defined particular risk groups and the risky practices that these undertook. Initially delineating these groups as either tainted by foreign influence, global homosexual culture, the globalized drug trafficking industry, American donors of blood coagulant, or inherently foreign themselves, Africa, right? The Spanish outbreak narrative soon adjusted itself to draw clear distinctions between a dominant traditional Spanish culture and these risk groups. The resulting narratives created an attacking virus that was at turns physical, cultural, and social, and the threat of AIDS became one that extended far beyond its ability to physically infect. The risk groups left in the wake of the first years of AIDS were thus bracketed, categorized as strangers to the state, and marked as outside the borders of what constituted the truly Spanish. That's it.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dean. I'm going to turn in my video again so I appear here for the Q&A. Thank you. Thanks very much. I really appreciate too how you've linked this to the some of the questions that I was going to ask about this context too, and that here we're reporting respectively 6 hours apart from our homes, you know, in what's amid the quarantine and the COVID 19 lockdown, and
Yeah.
so I wanted to ask about that too as a sort of the source of questions, but. I wanted to thank you too, because this reading is, for me, every time I teach this reading too, an excellent discussion with students about how media, and in this case, public media, establishes a framework, discursive and visual framework, to explain, in this case, again, this question of contagion or disease and so on, and that those metaphors have a performative character to them. They
Yeah.
participate in creating a reality, a social reality, because it participates in creating a social imaginary about disease, about contagion, about at-risk groups, and the questions of identity as well. So this is one of the reasons why this is assigned too for students within the framework of this course in media studies. So I want to thank you for that, because this is a really excellent case study for us to be looking at. So before I get into COVID-19 and questions about COVID-19, I wanted to ask you a couple of things. One is in relation to the 4 H's that you mentioned before, the 4 risk groups or at-risk groups, to jog our memory, then Haitians, hemophiliacs, homosexuals, and heroin users. The hemophiliacs were, particularly because of the many children were afflicted by hemophilia, considered to be oftentimes sort of like the innocent victims in comparison to the sort of culpability of the other three, being either racialized and other, or somehow involved in some kind of sexually aberrant behavior, non-normative or otherwise. So I wanted to know if you had a reflection about that in terms of the relationships between those or about those 4 risk groups and the differences among them too. If you could.
Yeah, yeah. And, so I allude, yeah. So in this talk, I allude to those 2 brothers, and I believe, do I write about them in the article? Are they?
They
Sorry,
appear,
I
yeah,
can't.
they appear more in the article. They do, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Right. So
A little
I
bit
talk about,
more,
okay,
yes.
I was trying to make sure. So, there's
Yeah.
some really, really interesting ways that
Mhm.
class gets involved when you start to look at these index cases of the brothers. So you have to remember too, these are in terms of the brothers, this is early days for Spain, but that writing about the brothers is all about them living in this really, really shitty barrio in Sevilla,
Mhm.
and right next to all of these other drug users. And so there's this sort of assumption of uncleanliness, right? Like of dirtiness,
Mhm.
of proximity to bad guys, right? Like to illness in a way. And so there's something in which these brothers are seen as already affected by illness and class.
Okay.
And so I think that happens. I do think it's something that is always kind of played upon a little bit in Spanish media, that there's this sense of, what do we do about hemophiliacs, because
Mhm.
they didn't do it on, like, it's no fault of their own,
Yeah.
but they're still tainted by this disease. And when I say tainted, I mean tainted by the sort of narrative surrounding the disease, not just infected, right? Like, so, and in fact, in hemophiliac, there was a few magazines put out by
Mhm.
more or less newsletters put out by hemophiliac associations in Spain at the time,
Mhm.
and they are like up in arms and really decrying the collapsing of their community with these others,
Mm.
right? Of as risk groups with others, right? And very much saying like, but we're not
Mhm.
that, right? And they want to take part in this narrative as well, right? To be like, but we aren't,
Right.
gay, and we aren't shooting up like illicit drugs, right?
Yeah.
We're doing something that's meant to be for ourselves. And I think you can really see that sort of warring in place in the visual narrative of the second news report that I'm talking about, where they're like, they're trying to say like, okay, look, they're doing something that's so similar to this drug user, but at the same time they're also saying, but it's different, I guess, like he's in his house doing this, right? He's and so they're trying to like figure out like it's really interesting to me because you see them like trying to articulate something and not really knowing how, right?
Okay.
Just saying like, it's a risk group and it's bad and they're sick and it's on them, but they're not, it's not their fault. And so I do think you see, just like you pointed out, you start to see a recurrence to children with hemophilia who are at risk. And so it's an attempt to like sort of to interact with children's innocence, right, and purported lack of sexuality, right, to kind of distance them even further from the quote unquote taint of HIV and AIDS.
Yeah. Okay. Great, thank you. No, it's certainly at issue, this question of the typing of behaviors or at-risk groups, and even of course the problem, the shift from discussing the at-risk groups to practices, right? And that shift that takes place to talk about not, for instance, homosexual community being at risk, but then same-sex sexual relations being at risk, and there's a displacement from the identity to the practice, right? And that's something that also comes to mind too in relationship to this. Is it something I wanted to ask then, I suppose, about the identities that are tied to this is about the index case. What you can offer us in terms of the more in detail about the myth of an index case of being traceable to the sort of one person to blame, scapegoated, or one type, as you've mentioned before, and you've brought this into discussion too with the current context. But if you could tell us more about the myth of the index case and the value that has.
Yeah, I think, it's something along the lines of what I say. Yesterday, in fact, we had a really interesting discussion in my course about carriers of an illness versus super spreaders versus index cases, right? And what all three of these sort of narratives or figures do for illness, right? And so, my students were thinking a lot about like, who's a super spreader? What does a super spreader mean, right? And the super spreader is, of course, I mean, you can think of the classic example of typhoid Mary, right? So someone that is healthy, right, or purportedly healthy, right, like seems to be healthy, but who in fact is infected and is shedding sort of the virus as they go. So like an asymptomatic carrier.
Right.
What we would say, right? But the super spreader kind of puts this like malignant spin on it, right? Like something that they're doing on purpose. And you get the same thing with AIDS, obviously. The infamous case of patient zero, Gaetan Duras, who is seen as like, he is the point of origin for everything, right? And because of him, he was a super spreader and he just sort of spread HIV everywhere, right? So I think that these index cases, right, so to sort of different from the super spreader, these index cases are often imagined as super spreaders, are often seen as, in the narratives constructed around them, are all sort of delineate who might get sick, what are the routes of transmission. So you have two things that are happening, right? First, you have the like epidemiological practice of designating index cases, right? Which says, and which is done for a reason, right? Which is, here's the first person we know of. Who are they in contact with? How might it spread through? Sorry, my boyfriend is sneezing in the background. And
no worries.
Awkward time for that to happen.
No worries.
Index cases and illness. So you have these index cases, right, that are seen as, or that let you know epidemiologically, right, what are the routes of transmission, who are they connected to, where might this virus go, right, what is the person like, what might be the underlying conditions that have caused their bodies to react in this manner, right? So there's things that make sense for an epidemiologist to study and to understand. The sort of problem you get, right, is when this becomes a plot, when is the narrativizing of the epidemiological spread, right? So it's so you see in the medical report, right, that I'm showing you, or about the gay man, where they have this information. He went to Turkey, he went to the US, he's had sex outside of his his relationship, but the way that it's written, right? So even though he's in purportedly in a monogamous stable relationship, he committed adultery, basically, right? Is the sort of narrativizing that's happening there. So the suggestion is be monogamous, be and be good, right? Be in a stable relationship, right? Non-monogamous relationships are non-stable. So there's tons of stuff there, right? And it connects the US and the number of AIDS cases in the US, and it connects Turkey, the exotic, the foreign, the Eastern, right? So many things are happening that is all about narrativizing medical and epidemiological fact. And so that's sort of the two things that an index case does for epidemiologists and for the media, right, and for the public. So we take these cases, these index cases, and not just epidemiologists are creating narratives, but the public media are creating narratives, as we're looking at in those two videos.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. In other words, like fact-based reporting is ultimately participating in this narrative, right? That's a fiction ultimately, right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Thank you. I wanted to ask then to talk about other contexts. Could be COVID-19. It could be other, even just not so long ago, the Ebola outbreak and the way it was covered under the very few cases in the United States, but the panic or scare around them, or really any other concern within, say, speaking about outbreak or in epidemiology, narratives that you see in comparison and contrast with the HIV/AIDS case, whether it's Spain or the United States, that we could learn from ultimately, or that we have, some exposing some of those similarities and differences that in more recent times, the way in which the media is covering it, the way in which elected officials are speaking about it, these kinds of questions and how they participate in this narrative too. Any thoughts about that? Any?
Yeah, tons. I mean, it's obviously, so we're in an HIV and AIDS section of my course right now, which was frankly serendipitous. It just happened that we were entering this section, and when all of this hit the fan, and it's all we can talk about, right? So in fact, it's almost like 30% AIDS is what we're talking about, and 70% COVID, because we can't. It's just on our brains, but it's really interesting because my students are seeing all sorts of, and everyone is seeing all sorts of connections between the outbreak of HIV and AIDS in the 80s and global responses to it now. And I think there are similarities to be drawn. I think there's also very real differences to be made. First of all, is the way that it's spread, right? So, HIV and AIDS is connected to quote unquote risky practices, right? So this is something that in the early years of the 80s, they use risk groups, and they sort of start to move away from using risk groups in late 80s, early 90s, and talk about risk practices, which is a much more, which is a better practice to do, because it sort of no longer focuses on those homosexuals doing that thing. It's more this action that can be done by anyone shouldn't be done, right? And so that's different, right? You can't stop a sneeze. You can't stop, right? Or you don't realize the ways that you're connected to others on a microbial level, right? When you cough in your hands and touch a doorknob, and then 5 minutes later, someone does the same thing, right? Or just touches that same doorknob. We don't necessarily think about those. And in fact, and with HIV and AIDS, a lot of the transmission is is deliberate and was known, right? It was sort of actions that one would take, particularly like by 83, 85, you knew what those actions were, despite a lot of misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's quite a lot of differences. I think government inaction in the U.S. has had a lot of people make connections to the outbreak of HIV and AIDS in the U.S. Right. I think there's been a lot of discussion around that. Right. Like Reagan's response to the AIDS epidemic, which was to like almost never say AIDS for 5 years. I think like never use the word. His press secretary like really infamously, the first time that the government actually used the word AIDS was as a joke. Sort of infamously, it was during a meeting with the press, and a reporter asked, like, what's this about AIDS? And the press secretary at the time said, AIDS, I don't have it, do you? And then like kind of laughed it off, and that was the end, right? That was as much discussion as we got from the government at that point. And this was years into the epidemic. And so I think, government inaction and is similar. The spread is different. People have talked about, and not to go on too long, sorry, but
No, please do. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I find really striking, people have talked a lot about, and in fact, Judith Butler has this really beautifully written in Undoing Gender idea about the sort of vulnerability of the human experience, and sort of our physical vulnerability or shared vulnerability as potentially linking us as humans. And it's something that I've always found really kind of like beautifully put, and also something really provocative for me. But I think we're also seeing like tremendous disparities in our vulnerabilities, right? And our shared humanity, right? So Hannah Jones, who's a writer, who's a journalist, sorry, has written about kind of the differences in humanity between Black people in the U.S. and any other group, and talking about, right, the perception of one's humanity and the likeliness of catching an illness, right, is already statistically higher for Black people in the U.S. than it is for others. And so this idea of like, can we all be human together, right? Does this link us? Can this illness be quote unquote the great equalizer, which is a term, used by tons of folks. And her answer, Hannah Jones's answer, is no, right? We're not equal. And physically we're not equal, right? Like biologically, we are statistically more prone to get illnesses because of structural inequalities. And so I think this is something too that is I don't know, similar and different, right?
Yeah.
It's similar in that there are bodies that are more at risk, right? Because of inequality. And this was the case for homosexuals, heroin users, intravenous drug users in the 80s, for hemophiliacs as well. And it's the case for people of color, Black people, poor people today as well. And so I think that those sort of, that inequality really strikes at this notion of of illness as the great equalizer, or of us as having some sort of shared humanity on the basis of all being potentially sick at some point.
Yeah, thanks for that too. As a reflection, it makes me think of well, many things actually, but one of them is that we tend to forget in hindsight, I guess, some of the great uncertainty that was taking place in the early 80s. In other words, that the mass not disappearances, but people would fall ill in countless numbers, and the thousands of people who died. And that the uncertainty around exactly questions of transmission, and also potentially even say like the misinformation that circulated about potential, say, home remedies or other medications that could be taken, these kinds of things. And that reminds me, that moment of uncertainty, and also maybe twinged with desperation too, because there is a hope that something can potentially cure or treat in illness, without necessarily understanding fully medically what is at play. and particularly in the beginnings of an illness that is not fully understood by the medical profession, that these kinds of questions too, and plays into that vulnerability, but also the uncertainty that it's easy to forget about, I suppose, in hindsight, right? So it reminds me of the COVID-19, where you also have people who are, there's a popular knowledge or common knowledge, it might be completely false, but about the different kinds of potential home remedies and ways to be able to protect yourself and so on, even what kind of mask protection one can use, whether or not that's actually viable or protective against viral transmission, these kinds of things. And so your comments too provoke a reflection about the structure of uncertainty at that moment and how people react to it in different ways. As much as, of course, inequality, the question of who's more vulnerable, even though it's a shared vulnerability, there's a structure of vulnerability as to, yes, some people are more vulnerable than others, clearly. And not just due to age, disability status or otherwise, but specifically because of the structure of inequality in a given society, access to healthcare, lack of access to healthcare, and how that is racialized and how that is structured in relation to inequality in the United States, but also here.
Absolutely.
In Spain, speaking from Madrid. It makes me think too, thinking about the just elected officials and with the Ebola. I don't even remember what year it is. The Ebola was under one of the Obama administrations. I don't remember if it was the first or the second. I have to look. I'm speaking off the top of my head, but the Ebola outbreak, where there was a nurse who was cured, and then there was a White House or a press event where Obama appears and with her, and he explains sort of the explanation is ultimately that there is no concern, that that she's completely cured, and there's a hug, there's an actual tact or touch, a moment of an embrace between the two. And I find that really striking because perhaps that's a moment where something had been learned from the crisis of the 1980s, where the silence of administration and also the fear that tact or that touch is a viable form of transmission, which it is not, in HIV/AIDS, it also led to a panic about touch, contact, human contact.
Yeah. Yep.
And then we see then that in the case when it really is an issue in another form of transmission, such as Ebola, that then now that is ultimately has been overcome and she's a cured patient, this notion of embracing of touch after the fact, after her release and full cure back to health, is a symbolic one that performs a gesture, but that gesture itself also ultimately says quite a bit about a calming manner, I suppose, and a reassuring manner to the viewing audience about the question of the non-fear of transmission, right? After a person has been cured. So that metaphor itself of tact, touch, and contact is one that certainly is an issue now today in COVID, because the forms of transmission, as you're saying, is very much either not necessarily always airborne, but certainly on surfaces, and there's a data about how long the virus can live on different kinds of surfaces, paper, glass, ceramic, etc. So these kinds of things are at issue and continue to be at issue, and so this is an observation without necessarily having a question behind it, but there are also great criticisms and from those who lived in particular the activisms of the 1990s and the moments, I think probably the height of ACT UP and so on, I have seen editorials without naming names that are really quite irate about the comparison between HIV and COVID-19. So I wanted to ask you about that too. That's my other question. If you see differences that, or ultimately if you wanted to speak to or to the criticisms of COVID from the perspective that it is not at all like the HIV/AIDS crisis, as much as others will say that it is.
Yeah, I think I'm one of one of the first things I think about is whether or not, um, or sorry, I'm trying to articulate this
Yeah.
clearly. So one of the things is, are we constructing risk groups in the
Yeah.
same way?
Yeah.
Okay, so like, let me just frame that sort of basically, right? So the answer, the immediate and obvious answer is sort of yes, right? Asian, like, Asian people are seen as,
Mm-hmm.
particularly Chinese folks, are seen as carriers, right? And there's been a huge uptick in discrimination against Asians broadly, in really horrific ways. With New York being sort of the new epicenter of the virus currently, right? With, I believe, more cases or more deaths than Italy, just New York itself. I think, yeah, and there have been several reports talking about it as well. It's now the American virus, right? If it ever were anything else,
Mm-hmm.
it is now the American virus, right? And so I wonder if the risk group is something that is going to stick or not. If and so, or if it's just following, but at a much more accelerated pace, because so much about COVID has been accelerated in a way that I don't think happened with HIV and AIDS. So just perception of, and I think this might be the sort of increased, the technology and sort of our increased mediated way that we live now. And so everything happens much more quickly, right? The information that we get is outdated 10 hours later. And so, and that's what it's felt like the entire time, right? Because information is being pushed to us, and most of us are just isolated at home looking at news and reading things online. And so the information that we're getting is fresh, is information that hasn't thoroughly been vetted all the time, is coming from all sorts of sources. And so there is misinformation, there's wrong information, there's old information out there at the same time. So all of that to be said, I think, some of the questions that I have based on what you're saying is, so have we constructed risk groups that are sticking, or is it just that we're moving so fast that we're now already in the phase where we're talking about risk practices, right? So with HIV and AIDS, this took years, right? So we have risk groups for years, right? And it's, it's the 4 H's for like 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, right? Until we start to talk about, sexual contact between heterosexuals, between all sorts of groups, right, that are different from the original just risk group, right? Heterosexuals that use drugs, homosexuals, gay male sex, right? Like these kinds of things. And then it's like, well, what about children with HIV? Or sorry, what about children with HIV and hemophilia? What about queer drug users? What about lesbians? What about heterosexual sex, right? So the nuances start to happen much later, and then we start to talk about practices. But so one of the things I'm wondering is, like, so do those risk groups stick with COVID, or is it just that we're so accelerated that we're already in the practices phase, the risky practices discussion? And so it's tough to know. But I think that's one of the big differences. I think that's what I see a lot of people talking about. The other thing that I see people talking about is that, some of my students mentioned yesterday, like, well, we're not seeing, we're reading these reports on, or not reports, or sort of stories about HIV and AIDS in the 80s, and it's, queer activists and just queer folks talking about seeing everyone die all around them. And my students were saying, like, well, we're not like really seeing that. Like, I don't get the sense of that, right? And one of the things that we wound up talking more about was, well, I mean, we're maybe not in those groups where that's happening, and I said, I think the stories would be different, and probably will be different, in a couple of months' time, from people in the medical profession. They will have these nightmare stories of, and already are, right? Like, of everyone's dying around me all the time, and this is a true nightmare. And so, but this is different because the medical personnel aren't necessarily in the risk groups, or who we believe to be in risk groups, right? They are being shown as being more likely to catch COVID now because of just being around folks all the time, and the sort of the incomplete,
Mhm.
masks aren't
Mhm.
enough, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, so I mean, these are just sort of thoughts off the top
Mhm.
of my head, but
Mhm.
it makes me think of these differences, right? You know, who is seeing the brunt of the illness,
Mhm.
right? Who's experiencing the
Mhm.
brunt of sort of
Mhm.
sort of public reactions to the illness too? And I think it's shifting so quickly that it's hard to get a pin on it, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
and an Asian person may feel differently, right?
Right. Mhm.
So
Right. Mhm.
um, and because I think that has stuck around a little bit longer,
Mhm.
and so there's part of my musings that might not quite be right, because I
Mhm.
do think that regardless of everything I'm saying, that sort of Asian discrimination has actually been on the rise and is sticking a
Yes.
little bit.
Yes.
Um, I don't think that they are perceived as a risk group still, though, but that
Mhm.
might be a privileged position that I'm
Mhm.
talking about, that or
Mhm.
sort of someone that has more information than others. I don't
Mhm.
know.
Mhm. It's a really great reflection too on how in the media is ultimately, in simultaneity of the media is influencing our digestion of this, and also saturation of information about it, our participation in creating media too. In the 1980s, there weren't things like Instagram and social media where users were media users were actually producing their own media or posting articles too, and so that changes the character of it too.
Hmm.
And this is
Hmm.
really fantastic. I want to thank you again. I think we'll end here because you've been very generous already with the amount of time you've dedicated to us. But it's been a really illuminating talk and Q&A too, to think through this together. So thank you very much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure, Dean, and I hope to see you very soon. I'm going to
Definitely. Thanks.
hope all is well, and we'll certainly be in touch. Yeah. Thanks very
Okay.
much. I'm
All
going
right.
to sign off here, and that way we'll save the talk. Okay, great. Thanks very
Okay.
much.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Muchas gracias.